So we're just going to get started. My name is Evelyn Benitez. I am a rent board specialist at the San Francisco Rent Board. And then I'm going to give my colleague the opportunity to introduce herself as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Van, and I'm also a rent board specialist at the San Francisco Rent Board.
So most of our presentation today is going to be a little bit focused on the rent board housing inventory, but we're also going to cover some background information about the law that made this enforceable, and also information about other services that we offer to both tenants and landlords. So I'm going ahead and ask David to go to the next slide, please. Okay, so first topic we're going to cover is just background information. Then we're going to cover reporting requirements under the housing inventory. And then we're going to show you exactly where you're going to submit that information. And then we're going to cover, again, other services that we offer to both tenants and landlords, specifically instances where tenants can get a decrease in their rent and instances where landlords are able to increase the rent. And then we're going to lastly give you all the opportunity to answer some or ask some questions. Next slide, please. All right, so the first question that we're going to answer is, what exactly is the San Francisco Rent Board? So the Rent Board is a city and county agency that implements the San Francisco Rent Ordinance. The Rent Ordinance was passed by the Board of Supervisors that passed in 1979 in an effort to protect tenants against excessive rent increases and to help them against unjust evictions, while also making sure that landlords get a fair and adequate rent in return. We support both tenants and landlords in San Francisco by providing them with information about the rent ordinance, and also to deliver that, we conduct rental arbitration hearings and mediation related to some housing disputes. Next slide, please. So an important question to highlight is that not everyone is covered under the rent ordinance. While most residential units are, there are some commercial, well, all commercial units and some dwellings that are entirely exempt from the ordinance. This includes certain dwelling units where the rents are controlled or regulated by another government unit, agency, or authority. So I would double check to make sure that this, before you stay throughout the entire presentation, that you make sure that you keep in mind that, if you live in a dwelling that's regulated by government union or agency or authority, not everything that is discussed in this presentation will apply to you, as well as for dwelling units that is in nonprofit cooperatives, owned or controlled by the majority of the residents, dwelling units that are owned by a nonprofit to the benefit of a corporation governed by the board of directors. Again, these are very specific, so it could be the case that this doesn't apply to you, but as well as, dorms that are owned by institution of higher education, high school, elementary school. These are, again, all of the things listed here are exempt by our rent ordinance. Next slide, please. Now, there are some units that are partially covered by a rent ordinance. So in other words, some units are covered. So let me rephrase this. So all units are covered by our just cause eviction protections, which we will again go more in detail with at the end of the presentation. But there are units that, while they are covered by our just cause eviction protections, they're not covered by the rent increase limitations under our ordinance. So again, this includes certain units whose rents are controlled or regulated by another government, agency, or authority. A common example would be like if you have a Section 8 voucher, landlords need to have a just cause eviction in order to evict that tenant. Their rents aren't under our rent ordinance. So they have to follow different rules that don't apply under our rent ordinance, as well as most single family homes, condominium and condos where the tenancy commenced on or after January 1st, 1996 are in this category as well, where they're covered by just cause eviction protections, but not the limitations of our rent increase limitations. As well as mostly newly constructed residential units that were first occupied or received the certificate of occupancy after June 13th, 1979. And also units that have been determined by the rent board to have undergone substantial rehabilitation. Next slide, please. The main question of today is what exactly is the rent board housing inventory? So essentially this became effective under Rent Ordinance 265-20, which was passed unanimously by the Board of Supervisors and signed by the mayor in December of 2020. And essentially it changed our rent ordinance by adding section 37.15, and it's titled Reporting Obligation and Licensing. So essentially, before this law took effect, a landlord didn't need the rent board's permission to impose annual and banked rent increases. So every year we have essentially a list of every year where the landlord can increase the rent by a certain percentage. Landlords who don't, impose that percentage could also bank it and impose it at a later time. And they did not need our permission to impose those rent increases. But with this new law, all property owners are now required to provide certain information to the rent board. And in exchange for landlords in particular, they will receive a license to impose those annual and bank increases. So if they don't comply with these requirements that, again, we'll go more in detail in a little bit, they won't receive that license in order to impose those annual and bank increases. Next slide, please. So this law kind of takes into effect in 2 times. So part of it has already taken effect. So for units and buildings of 10 residential units or more, they actually had to have reported this information by June of this year, and then update that information every March after that. However, that's a small percentage of the entire housing stock. So most people haven't reported yet and are not required to report yet, and usually fall in this next category where single family homes, condos, and units where there's less than 10 units in the building. They are required to start reporting this information starting March 1st of next year, and then update that information every March after that. And then this is information, in the next section is information that that you need to also update, not necessarily with those fixed deadlines, but changes to the name, the business contact information. If there's any changes to that, that's something that they need to report to us within 30 days of that change. Next slide, please. So first, let's cover what exactly the reporting requirements are. So the first thing that everyone needs to report, so all property owners, so this is not just landlords, but anyone who owns property in San Francisco needs to report into our portal. So first is the mailing address of each unit. So that doesn't necessarily mean that's the address of the property that you're reporting, but the address that would be best to reach the owner of the property. And then they also have to report the status of each unit, whether that unit is occupied by the owner, which could be the case, whether it's occupied by a person who's not the owner. So whether that's a tenant or a family member that's living in, the owner's property. And they also have to identify whether that unit is vacant, or whether, it's not residential. So whether, sometimes there's buildings where the bottom unit is, not residential, it's a commercial tenant, that's in a category that they would have to indicate. And I thought it would be helpful to identify what we mean by occupied by the owner. So the definition that we have is a unit that is occupied by the owner of record, either full-time or a part-time basis. So there's no, minimum requirements or threshold that the owner has to meet in order to be qualified that he lives there, or they live there. And it can't be rented at any time. And it's worth noting that this is the same definition that we use to exempt, for instance, owner-occupied units from the rent board fee. So it's the same definition, just to maintain consistency. Next slide, please. Okay, so what information do I need to report? So if it's a unit that is occupied by the owner and it's not residential, the owner will be asked to provide their name, and they are not required to report any other information other than that. And they don't need to provide any evidence. They just need to log into our system, and we'll go more into that in detail. You'll actually see screenshots of the portal, provide their name, claim their property with PIN that we provide to them, which again, I'll talk more in detail later. And that's it. You won't be asked any other questions about your property or your units. Next slide, please. So if the unit is occupied by a non-owner, so a person that's not the owner, whether that's a tenant, whether that's the children of the landlord, a family member, or if it's vacant, they need to report the name and business contact information of the owners, if not the owners, the property manager, that are in charge of addressing any habitability issues. And the purpose of that is just to have some contact information there that's accessible to anyone in case we get a call from, the tenant or the person who's living there, to address specific issues. So we have a point in contact, and the specific information that we ask for is mailing address, phone number, email address. And the owner will also be asked if there's like a better address that we can have for them on file to send them information about the rent board fee. The owner will also be asked to report their business registration number if applicable. So again, this doesn't apply to landlords or owners who have properties that are technically on the smaller side. So this only applies to basically buildings that have units more than three units. And then we will also be asking for the approximate square footage, number of bedrooms and bathrooms of the unit. Next slide, please. So again, these are additional requirements. So if the unit is occupied by a non-owner or is vacant, so if the unit is occupied, the owner will need to put in information about the date that the occupancy began. If the unit is vacant, then they will need to put in information of when that vacancy began. So essentially when the last person who lived there moved out that very next day. And then they will also need to put in information about any start or end dates of any vacancies or occupancies that happened within the last 12 months. And then also another thing that they will need to report is whether if it is owner or not owner, if it's not owner occupied, so if there's someone living in that unit, the owner must put in information about the rent in increments of $250. So not the exact amount, but in increments of $250. And they will also need to put in whether that base rent includes utilities. And this includes water, sewage, recycling, gas, and electricity. Next slide, please. And if the unit is occupied by a non-owner and the owner has substantially complied with the requirements that I mentioned, the owner will then receive a license in order to impose annual and bank increases for that tenant. And this license will last until the following February. So for the smaller landlords, the landlords who own units that are smaller than 10 units for that whole building, they don't have to report that information until March. So their license will last until the following February, so of 2023, I believe. And these licenses will be accessible all the time through the portal. They will be able to download it and print it out. This information will also be relatively public, so anyone will be able to look up whether this specific unit has met the housing inventory requirements, and thus the owner is able to impose these increases with the license that the rent board has given them. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to give you some visuals, so where you report this information is going to be portal.sfrb.org. So feel free to take pictures of that link, but I know that this presentation is also going to be available to you all at some point. So this information will be available to you. So this is kind of like a screenshot of the portal. You can also log into our website, and then there's a button that will lead you to this page, essentially where it says property owners and managers, create an account. That's the first step where you will sign up. And again, it's not just landlords who need to submit this information, it's anyone who owns property. But again, the degree of information varies. Obviously, a landlord will have to report more information than a regular homeowner. The homeowner will just have to indicate that they live in that property, and no other questions will be required for that homeowner. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to highlight this information because this is a part of actually creating an account. So when you go to claim your property, it's going to give you the option to add a property. It's going to ask you whether you are the property owner, the property manager, and it's also going to ask you information about the parcel number and the PIN. The PIN is something that you will likely get from us. You should have received a notice last year with that portal PIN information. We are sending notices sometime this year, I believe closer towards the end of the year, reminding you about the housing inventory, but also reminding you about the fee, and you should have access to that PIN as well. Additionally, if for whatever reason you don't have access to this PIN, you're welcome to give us a call and we're able to look up that information for you. That way you're able to actually claim the property in our portal. Next slide, please. Other things to take into consideration is that tenants, although this function is still kind of in the works right now, tenants will have the option to report certain information into the housing inventory themselves. And also it's worth stressing that most of this information that landlords, homeowners are reporting is public and it's not confidential. So people will be able to look up, the property information and see, what units there are, how many bedrooms there are. Even right now, you can look up, who hasn't or has paid the housing inventory fee. The only thing that does remain confidential, though, is the owner's mailing address. So that information will not be open to the public. And it's worth stressing that the housing inventory is not a rental registry. That is defined, that is typically defined under state law. This is, we're not appealing to that. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm gonna give my coworker the opportunity to continue from here, and we will address whatever questions pop in the chat at the end of the presentation.
All right, everyone. So what resources does the rent board offer to tenants? So one of the things is called the decrease in housing services. A tenant may file a petition with the rent board for a reduction in base rent when the landlord has substantially decreased the tenant's housing services without a corresponding decrease in rent, or if they failed to provide a housing service that was reasonably expected under the circumstances or promised prior to the commencement of the tenancy. So in other words, if the unit is under rent control, a tenant has that right to file with us and try to ask for a rent reduction if a housing service has been decreased, taken away, or compromised. But this can only be done after a tenant has reached out to the landlord on several occasions and the landlord has not responded. And so then they have a right to come to us as the independent neutral party to help them, try to get a, rent reduction on their rent. Next slide, please. So another type of service that we offer is a petition to file for an unlawful rent increase. A tenant may file a petition for a refund of rent overpayments and resetting of the rent to the proper amount if the landlord has unlawfully increased the rent or failed to properly calculate or discontinue a pass-through. A tenant may also file a petition to have the rent board determine the tenant's unlawful rent. So if you are under rent control, a landlord can only raise rent at a certain percentage. And that percentage rate is calculated by us each year. And so if a tenant believes the landlord has, did not follow that percentage of the year, or sometimes landlords, they do banked increases and they may, miscalculated. A tenant certainly has that right to file a petition and have us, help them figure it out what the proper rent should be. Next slide, please. So the excessive rent claims by subtenants. So this is what we call a subtenant petition. A subtenant, again, this all has to fall under rent control, in a rent ordinance. So if a subtenant who believes that the rent that is being paid is more than a proportional share of the total rent, may file a petition on that basis against the master tenant. And this is pursuant to rules and regulations of 6.15C, subsection 3. A subtenant who subleases the entire rental unit may file a petition against the master tenant under the ordinance 37.3, small c, if the subtenant believes that the initial rent paid to the master tenant, either individually or in combination with other subtenants, it's more than what the master tenant is paying to the landlord. So again, if you are a subtenant and you believe you've been overcharged by the master tenant, and it's under rent control, then you have a right to file a subtenant petition. And basically you have to provide proof, that, you are indeed overpaying. And then we will, take that petition, set up a meeting, with one of our hearing officers, and we will determine whether or not you've been overcharged. And if that's the case, then we will have to order the master tenant to refund you. Next slide, please. So what services does the rent board offer to the tenants? There is what we call a financial hardship. And a tenant may seek relief from payment of the following types of rent increases or pass-throughs on the grounds of financial hardship. And a tenant can file a financial hardship application with the rent board. This is applicable to capital improvement pass-throughs, water revenue bond pass-throughs, general obligation bond pass-through, but only those amounts are attributable to general obligation bonds approved by the voters on or after November 5th of 2019. Utility pass-through and operating and maintenance expense rent increase. Financial hardship relief is not available for all other types of rent increases, including the annual and banked rent increase or rent increases authorized by the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act. To put it mildly, if a tenant, is given the regular annual rent increase, that is not considered a hardship. But, if a tenant is given an annual rent increase and there is an additional pass-through costs, like any of the ones I just mentioned, a tenant, may file a financial hardship to try to, challenge on those improvement and bond pass-throughs. And if you qualify, then you don't have to pay that. Next slide, please. So when does the rent board allow landlords to raise rent? The annual allowable, the annual and banked rent increases is the landlord is permitted to impose the allowable increases each year without filing a petition. The rent board recalculates the amount of the annual allowable increase each year based on 60% of the increase in supply. So the landlords can bank or accumulate the annual increases and impose it in later years. First of all, the annual allowable rent increase, that can happen once every 12 months. Again, under rent control laws, a landlord can increase rent once every 12 months by using the percentage rate that we set for that year. If for some reason the landlord did not give a rent increase for that year, the landlord, did not lose the opportunity, to increase it. What the landlord is doing is saving it or banking it. So they're putting it in the bank, and then later, later years that come about, the landlords can go ahead and, use that banked increase, and do it later on. Next slide, please. When does the rent board allow the landlords to raise rent? So for the capital improvement pass-through petitions, a landlord may petition the rent board to pass through to tenants the cost of certain renovations to the property, which are considered capital improvements. There's no charge for filing a petition. So a capital improvement materially adds to the value of the property, appreciably prolongs its useful life, or adapts it to new uses, which may be amortized over the useful life of the improvement of the building. So some examples for capital improvement, which are pretty common, is replacing a roof, replacing windows, outside painting of the building. Those are capital improvement. Changing out a water heater. So these things a landlord can pass through some of the costs to the tenants. But in order to do that, the landlord has to, first of all, complete the work first. And then the landlord has 5 years after the work has been completed to file a petition. And there's a formula on the petition that the landlord has to follow. And then, it gets passed on to the tenants after we hold a hearing on it. Next slide, please. So when does the landlord allow, when does the rent board allow the landlords to raise rent? And this is rent increases not requiring a rent board petition. So a portion of the landlord's cost to repay the general obligation bonds, which is charged annually on the property tax bill, and the water system improvement revenue bonds, which is charged on the water bill, may be passed through to the tenants without filing a petition. However, the landlord must use the worksheet provided by the rent board in order to calculate the rent increases. So these two pass-throughs, we don't require a petition to be filed. On our website, there are worksheets provided, which the worksheet has to be attached to the rent increase notice. These two bond pass-throughs can only be done at the same time the landlord is given the tenants the annual allowable rent increase. And so it's important for the landlords to have copies of the previous water bills and the property tax bills, and plug in the numbers on that worksheet. And so once you have the calculation done, that is the pass-through amount, and that should be stated on the rent increase notice that you're giving to the tenants. Next slide, please. When is the rent board allowed the landlords to raise rents? So rent increase is based on vacancy decontrol. So the San Francisco rent ordinance does not regulate the initial rent for a new tenancy. So landlords are allowed to set rents for new tenancies at market rate. The landlord may be entitled to increase the rent to market rate in certain roommate situations when the original tenants no longer permanently reside in the unit. The landlord may, but not required to file a petition for determination of rights under Section 614 or Costa-Hawkins. So one of the things is, when a unit has become vacant, this is the time where the landlord can set the rent to whatever he or she wants. And if it's in a rent control building, it's the same, thing that's allowed. But once that market rate is set, thereafter, the landlord, in order to raise the rent and if this is under rent control, then the landlord has to, it's only allowed to give a rent increase with the percentage rate that we set. But the initial rent on the market rent, set it to whatever the market trend is. For 614 and Costa-Hawkins, basically is once the original tenant moves out, is no longer in residence. And if there are subtenants living there, there are still people living there, this is also the time for the landlord to get to raise the rent to market on the subtenants. So that's, the Costa-Hawkins Act. Next slide, please. So there are, under the rent ordinance, there is, the eviction control. So what that means is the landlord cannot evict a tenant without a just cause. So these are the common ones, non-payment of rent, habitual late payment of rent, frequently bounced checks, failure to cure a substantial breach of rental agreement or lease. If the tenant is a nuisance or a substantial interference with the comfort, safety, or enjoyment of other tenants and of the building, the nature of which must be severe, continuous, or reoccurring in nature. Illegal use of the unit is another one, and it's not including the mere occupancy of an unwanted rental unit or a single violation of San Francisco short-term rental law that is cured by the tenant within 30 days of written notice by the landlord. The tenant has refused, after written request by the landlord, to execute a written extension or renewal of an expired rental agreement for a further term of like duration under terms that are materially the same as the previous agreement. The tenant has refused, after written notice to cease, to allow the landlord access to the rental unit as required by state or local law. And the only tenant residing in the unit at the end of term of the rental agreement is a subtenant that is not approved by the landlord. Okay, next slide, please. In addition to those previous just cause, there are what we call no fault evictions. So owner occupancy or, what we call owner move-in. So owner occupancy or in limited circumstance, occupancy by a member of the landlord's immediate family, or what we call relative move-in. Landlord seeks to recover possession in good faith in order to sell the unit in accordance with the condominium conversion approved under the San Francisco subdivision ordinance. So it's condo conversion. To demolish or to otherwise permanently remove the rental unit from the housing use. Most of this we've seen where landlords have illegal units. Usually they are in-law units or converted garages that are not up to code. So it's to demolish that, or what we call demolition. Another one is, to perform capital improvements or rehab work that will make the unit temporarily uninhabitable while the work is being performed. The tenant must be allowed to reoccupy the unit immediately after the work is completed. So there are times when landlord, needs the tenants to temporarily vacate so they can do some, upgrades, capital improvement, or rehabilitation work. And again, this is only a temporary eviction. Relocation fee may be applicable. And, once the work is completed, the tenant, has to be allowed back in at the same rent that they were paying. Then the next one, another no-fault eviction, it's called the Ellis Act. Basically is pulling the entire building off the rental market. The landlord is no longer interested in the rental business, so it needs all tenants to vacate. And finally, to perform lead remediation abatement work required by the San Francisco Health Code. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're gonna open this up for any questions at this time.
Does anyone have any questions? You're welcome to just say it out loud or type it in the chat. All right, so again, if there's no questions or if there isn't any questions that come to mind at the moment, let me just, I'll share the next slide. Oh, can we share the next? Oh, thank you. So if you do end up having a question, you're more than welcome to either visit us during our hours. I believe our hours are from 10 to 2 every day. You're also welcome to call our counseling line, which is on the screen right now. You can also email us if you have general questions specifically about like the housing inventory at this email right there where it says housing inventory email. And if you just want to kind of familiarize yourself with the different rules that we explained throughout this whole presentation, different laws, different just cause eviction protections or things related to the housing inventory, you're welcome to just visit our website and just kind of mess around with the resources that we have there. And then I'm just going to read the comment that is posted here that reminding you all that this presentation will be available on YouTube next week in case you want to go back on any information that we covered today. All right, thank you, Doris. It was a pleasure presenting to you all. I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everybody. I hope the information was helpful and useful. And if anything doesn't make sense, please reach out to us, okay?
All right. Thank you both so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.